Welcome back, everybody. This is Craig from the Acid Horizon podcast, and we have a fantastic episode for you today on the revolutionary imagination. But before we begin, just some housekeeping. This month, on May 18th, we start a new reading group, Philosophers and the Friend, hosted by our own Will. This will be a reading group on the philosophy and politics of friendship, including works by Foucault, Derrida, and many more. We feel absolutely grateful that many of you have chosen to sustain us, especially during our difficult times, and join our reading groups and form a thriving community around the work that we find important. When you become a sustainer on our Patreon, it helps us do other things and grow other aspects of the podcast, namely the truly independent publishing effort that we are attempting to create called Ocular Editions. For those of you who supported the Acephalus Kickstarter, we just want you to know that the deck portion of the Kickstarter effort is going into production this month in conjunction with another campaign that I'm launching for a personal project of mine called Vintagia. If you are an educator, a therapist, a community organizer, or just somebody who's generally interested in enriching imaginal worlds, please drop down into the show notes and just check out my link for the Vintagia Kickstarter. I guess you could say that I hacked or detoured the classic Chinese Book of Changes, or the I Ching, and used that system to create a new imaginal matrix that has prompts for writers, musicians, philosophers, and all kinds of dreamers and wanderers. So go ahead and check that out. And as you are taking a look at all of that, let's get to our conversation with Richard Gilman-Opalsky and a discussion about the ideas that appear in his Imaginary Power, Real Horizons, the Practicality of Utopianism.
Welcome to Acid Horizon. Today we have an interview that is a long time coming. We have Richard Gilman-Opalsky here with us, who is an author and, as we've called him, a philosopher of revolt. Our listeners likely know him from texts like Spectres of Revolt, or I think many of us know him for Precarious Communism and, of course, Communist Ontologies. Today, he's here to talk about his recent book, Imaginary Power, Real Horizons, the Practicality of Utopianism. He does his work out of the University of Illinois at Springfield, and we're very lucky to have him on today. Thank you so much for coming on, Richard.
It's a pleasure and an honor, so happy to do it.
Yeah, so I really appreciate what the book is attempting to lay out, and sort of the broadness of the way in which utopianism sort of sinks into different elements of interactive experience. One of those experiences being revolution. But the first thing that I wanted to sort of jump into is unpack for our listeners and readers what you're trying to get at when you talk about the historical claim of the necessity of practicality in revolutionary assertions and activity. What has been the historical issue at play when there are demands for practicality in revolutionary thought and activity?
Yeah, so I think it's a great way to get into things. Excellent start. Well, there's really two, I would say, historical issues at work there. The first one has to do with reactions against revolutionary politics. The first one has to do with concerns about the demands of revolutionaries as they relate to a structural transformation of the world as we know it, as they relate to the abolition of the existing state of things and the creation of something new. So one aspect of it is, you could say, an accessory to the revolutionary history. It's not so much the beating heart of the revolutionary politics, but it surrounds it. And so you can see that very early on, for example, in the way in which many Marxists actually took seriously Edward Bernstein. And a part of the importance of Rosa Luxemburg's confrontation with Bernstein's evolutionary socialism was precisely because too many Marxists were taking seriously the impracticality of revolution and the impossibility of its aims. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect has to do with what I understand to be in a reductionist and overdetermined reading of Marx's materialism. The notion, for example, that anything having to do with the imagination, anything having to having any clear connection to philosophy is something which Marx himself and Marxists have to oppose and reject. And so that would be obviously what I would regard a bad reading of the 11th thesis on the theses on Feuerbach, right? This sort of turning Marx's concerns about philosophy, concerns about the in vogue Hegelianism of his day into some kind of a total opposition to thinking, into some kind of a total opposition to philosophy and the imagination, forgetting, of course, that Marx was a philosopher and he was thinking about, different forms of life. And he was, thinking about the abolition of the existing state of things for certain, for reasons, having to do with the possibility of a different state of things. So, if we're talking about inside and around Marxism and revolutionary politics, these would be the two things that I really want to confront, in my work. I really want to sort of insist in my work that this practicality reaction, which I think is now in some ways more dangerous even than it was at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, but it has to be rejected. And that we also should not run away from, philosophy or the imagination as if it were nothing but a field of utopian impracticality.
No, I think this is incredibly important, and especially in light of, as you're saying, the kind of philosophy that Marx was rejecting. Folks, we don't want to let the best philosophy could be determined by Bruno Bauer and Ludwig Feuerbach, because they were both pretty bad at what they did. They were the Slavoj Žižeks of their day, which is Hegel is revolutionary. Hegel can do all the work for you. You've just got to follow me and speak in the same idiom as I do. And then, of course, when the revolution happens in 1848, Feuerbach runs away to, quote unquote, get away from his wife and his publisher to join the revolution. It doesn't match his absolute sort of anthropological Hegelianism, and so he goes back and does nothing for the rest of his life. No, actually, he writes a book on nutrition. That's the thing he does after that. He gives up on philosophy entirely. Whereas Marx sticks to, and this is one of the questions, a question I have really is, he sticks to a kind of radical negativity that cannot help but some ways be philosophical. And this has come up in a couple of our episodes recently as well. We were talking to Jasper Burns recently, and a lot of communist theorists such as yourself are returning to in my view, best definition of communism from the German ideology, which is a text which is often read as kind of fundamentally anti-anarchistic because of its oppositional relationship to someone like Max Stirner. But when they're critiquing him, they call him a cop, and they say they're going to abolish more things, and they're going to abolish like human rights and stuff. So actually a bit more negative than even Stirner or their understanding of him would come towards. So I just wanted to ask, what is it about this definition of communism from the German ideology, the definition that says communism is the real movement that abolishes the present state of things, and the conditions of this movement result from real conditions in the present? I've buggered up the second clause of that, but it's close enough. Why do you think we should return to this definition of communism? And why do you think it gives us so much richness for philosophical discussion?
So, and I really appreciate the points you added to that. That was really, really important about Feuerbach and Bauer. I think those are important parts of the story. So part of it has to do with the 20th century, and part of it has to do with the century that Marx didn't live to see a day of, but is in many ways associated with, in terms of thinking about, what Eric Hobsbawm called the short 20th century. It's essentially a century that is understood through a Marxian frame. Hobsbawm is great, but it's a century Marx didn't live to see. And one of the casualties of the 20th century has been Marx's idea of communism, I would claim. And so in that passage from the German ideology that communism is for us the real movement that abolishes the present state of things, that is sort of the positive statement in the passage where he's saying what Marx and Engels are saying what communism is. But it's interesting what the preceding sentence does. It is a negative definition. It's saying what communism isn't. And what is in that sentence is that communism is for us not a stable state. It is not an ideal to be established in the world. It is not a thing that we establish and defend as a fixed, static apparatus that is somehow an institutionalization of an idea. I mean, this couldn't be, and especially not in the German ideology, this couldn't be how Marx would have been thinking of communism as just another idea, just one other idea to be taken up in the battlefield of ideas, on the battlefield of ideas. So today, I think a part of the importance of the original concept of communism there, at least in the German ideology, is to go to war against the idea that still reigns supreme throughout much of the world, not only in the US or in the UK, that when we think communism, we think of established states, essentially institutions of governance. More specifically, we think about men like Stalin or some, ideologically vilified image of Lenin. And we have this whole sort of ideological apparatus, which has told us how to think about communism, which has to be broken. And if we don't go to war against that concept of communism, essentially we give the concept of communism over to our enemies. And I think one of the greatest surprises to a lot of Marxists, myself included, in the 21st century, is that the Cold War isn't over. I mean, it's entered into this very peculiar phase, certainly a permutation, not the one that Hobsbawm is thinking of when he's talking about the short 20th century. But nonetheless, we still need to defend ideas that are good. We have to set up the barricades around a history of struggle, and we have to defend it against all kinds of ideological vilification, which is still happening in this new Cold War. I mean, in the United States, just to put a sort of a sharp point on it, and then finish that, is that in the United States right now, there's so much concern about Marxists and socialists and anarchists. We have a head of state who talks more about Marxism than all of the professors added up at most U.S. universities. I mean, he's pathologically fixated on that. And it's not original. There's nothing original about it. It simply is it is a continuation of a certain line of thinking that communists like us have to, if we can use that, which I very much like, what it means to be a communist is always a question for communists. And so communists like us aren't finished fighting against this dangerous weaponized misconception of Marx and communism. And I mean, the other point there, and then I know I said that was the last point, but the other major piece of that is that I don't think that we need to go back to defend and resuscitate. I mean, this is, to me, essentially missing the most fundamental lesson of Marx, is that we would attempt to do something exactly again that has been tried before. I mean, you have to look at the material conditions of the struggle. You have to look at what's going on right now. And so we need to think about what it means to be a communist, today. This is the opening section of the book, right? Is a question of the imagination. What can it mean to be a communist today is the introduction to the book.
I want to add on because we've spent a lot of time talking about Marxist self-identification, and I've got a very close, very particular kind of anarchist friend who argues that Marxism often operates as sort of an intellectual isolation and capture of communism and treats struggle as a sort of generalizable tendency for their particular image of history. And in the opening chapter of your book, there's a lot of discussion about how anarchism within the communist movement has been overlooked. Not just, of course, it's been suppressed. Anarchists are often the first victims in political purges, but I like that while there is comments like your discussion of Makhno and the resistance against Soviet imperialist adventures, in the earlier chapters, anarchism is treated as something that's tragically overlooked. And I wanted to sort of pick your brain about, because you name check the classical anarchists, but I want to add like one or two more maybe that seem to be overlooked around the time of the Second International, because Ukrainian anarchism is present, but I'm wondering, what would a world look like had, for example, Gustav Landauer and Max Stirner been in the conversation around the communism as a movement? And I'm wondering if maybe this desire to return to Benjamin also demands a need to return to who Benjamin was around. Obviously, Landauer being one of the major influences. That's often understated.
Yeah, another great question and an important part of our conversation for sure. In some ways, it follows perfectly from the last part, because it seems to me that when we return to the concept of communism from the German ideology, it is explicitly talking about processes, not end states. Right? It's perhaps most explicit about those 2 points, right? That it's not an established state, and it refers to a process. What I understand by real movement is that it's a process. So anarchism today is, and I can go back to Landauer and Stirner in a moment, but anarchism, I would say today, this is something I've been working on for many years now, is a crucial part of a future Marxism, which is to say that this opposition that still somehow lives, it needs to be finally killed. This idea that there is a hard ideological incompatibility between the insights of the anarchists and those of the Marxists. I mean, you're talking about, Bakunin on Marx's couch, drinking and, in the First International, and arguing and slanders around the Gotha program and all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, the insights of the anarchists in the second half of the 19th century proved to be absolutely right in the 20th. And today, I would argue that all Marxists need to claim and actively integrate anarchist sensibilities, right? Which I don't think were ever incompatible with the concept of communism we were just discussing from the German ideology. And I think Marx was aware of this, right? And Marx was aware of the sort of dialectical relationship between, what he was doing and what his anarchist critics were doing. Now, in terms of the hypothetical question, right, Will, about what would communism have looked like if it were more sort of, or what would be, as it were, if it were more, if it had integrated more of Landauer and Stirner. This is a difficult question to answer. I don't know exactly how to answer it, other than to say that some of the anarchists that were characterized by other anarchists as too individualistic, right, in their orientation, as not being sufficiently social. There's all these splits within anarchism, the famous debates between Murray Bookchin and others about social anarchism and lifestyle anarchism, and Renzo Novatori, the more sort of Nietzschean types of anarchist sensibilities. Putting that debate on the shelf for a moment, I think that later Marxists in the 1960s and the 1970s were trying to appreciate small, rhizomatic, micro-revolutionary ruptures, what I often treat in my work as revolts, that weren't, let us say, world historical in terms of the scale of their intervention, right? They didn't have this kind of world historical impact on structural transformation, political economy, or even life. But Marxists did come to a somewhat, I would say, they did have a kind of many of them did have a kind of a sensibility of Landauer and Stirner, right? So the Marxists who were trying really hard to move beyond Althusser and really appreciate what was going on in 1968, or even somebody like Castoriadis, who's often described as an anarchist who doesn't know it. I'm not saying that's true, but the idea that these things are not in there, I think, is false. They're a crucial part of the history. You can't have the history of Marxism and communism without, and that's why I'm always dealing with anarchist sources in my work. And second, with regard to, again, Stirner and Landauer, I think a part of this it would mean an orientation towards an appreciation of small things. Because, a lot of Marxists want big things. We want to change everything. We want to change the whole thing. We want to abolish. Hey, that's, just a little thing, abolish the existing reality. And so I think, Marxism has had to incorporate, consciously or not, that would maybe be the example of Castoriadis, right? An appreciation of smaller things that could potentially become bigger. It's like when Felix Guattari says, will all these micro revolutions in the essay Why Italy become really revolutionary? There will be no more October revolutions. Guattari is expressing this idea that, of course, he wants another. He wants the October, but it's not realistic. We have these small things. And so then the task, and I think it is still the task right now, is to think about what small things can become, and to not foreclose the possibility that small things could become big things without being overly ideological about that, and saying that they definitely will be, and I think this is a crucial orientation in politics right now. I look out sometimes and see these somewhat disappointing liberal reactions to the resurgent neo-fascist politics of our time. And I think, that's too bad. There has to be more conversation about capitalism and less about Trump. We want to talk less about individual men, and we want to talk more about, society, politics, forms of life. And we got to be more imaginary than just to think about how to get another milquetoast capitalist back in place. But then there's another part of me that is like, well, wait a minute. We don't know what things can become. We don't know how things might go off the rails, right? There is some conversation about race and class and capitalism. I was at a rally that I was reluctant to go to last weekend, for political reasons was my reluctance. That there were speeches full of talk of capitalism and Gaza and talking about, race and class, and actually talking about May Day, because it was 2 days after May Day. It was a rally on Saturday, 2 days after. The first speaker, who I was fully expecting to be disappointed with, stood up and started talking about anarchists, started talking about Albert Parsons and August Spies and Lucy Parsons. And I said, we shouldn't foreclose the possibility that these other things could become something else. And so, that's sort of a long roundabout way of saying that, I think there was too long of a time when the Marxist response to the anarchists was to say, you're talking about little things. You're talking about individualistic types of things. That would be sort of in the, Nietzschean Novatore mold, or the Stirner characterization of Stirner, which I don't even think is totally fair. But nonetheless, these small things may be the things we've got. And I'm still, even though I'm a philosopher of the imagination, and I insist on philosophy and imagination and the practicality of utopianism, I'm a materialist. I approach these things as a materialist, So I would really insist on this point.
One question I have actually regarding the function of the imagination is, so I guess a lot of times when we have sort of discussions, particularly in a space like Acid Horizon about the imagination, one of the most sort of common sort of thinkers people come up, it would resonate with, is someone like Mark Fisher, who popularized the phrase from either Jameson or Zizek. I can't remember who. I think he didn't remember who either, to be honest. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Now, at least in terms of, maybe because I've become, I don't know, I've spent more time in orgs, I've been more radicalized as I've gotten older. I think there's more of a sense now that people can, in a way, in sort of a negative sense, imagine a world beyond capitalism, because capitalism is making everything hurt much more. And you can sort of imagine a world in which the harms of capitalism are not operative. It's just that in, I guess, the kind of the last time we tried asking nicely, electorally with Sanders and Corbyn, for some reason, we tried asking nicely. And in a way, we could imagine a better world than this one, but we were just told no. And it seems like at this point, the impasse, or maybe it's just the unspeakability of what might have to be done on any platform that's going out, any content that can go out on a platform, is, and I struggle to imagine what it would mean to achieve the thing that we've already imagined, the abolition of the present state of things. And I think you really hit on this as well when it comes to your sort of discussion of sort of the non-revolutionary forms of socialism that is today, we can call, social democracy, or even maybe democratic socialism, where the impossibility of getting these post-war institutions back is historical, it's material, on the basis that there's no longer a force of communism that's going to threaten our ruling, our Western sort of global North bourgeoisie into giving us anything. And so the most practical institutional way of doing things is actually the most impossible. How do you think imagination then, rather than in terms of just imagining communism, in terms of imagining how we get there, or imagining forms of resistance to means of abolishing, how do you think the imagination plays that role? Because otherwise, because your account of imagination is much richer than just the production of images. It's also about the production, as I understand it, of new social relations, which sounds like we talk about images of new social relations and communism, but no, actually, insofar as you're describing a process, it has to be an active imagination of new forms of relating, if I understand that correctly.
Yeah, wow. I mean, that's very rich. There's a lot that we could probably hang out with that to the end of the conversation. It's so much. Yeah, I mean, so first, to me, with Jameson's famous line, he also said that the opposite of utopianism is not dystopia, it's the status quo. And so I quite like that, although, I mean, one disagreement is that I don't see why the status quo can't already be a dystopia. It seems to me that one could say both. But I think the kernel of that idea from Jameson is that, if we are going to move beyond acceptance, I mean, practically, politically, in terms of forms of struggle, or anything else philosophically, we are going to have to reject the status quo. I mean, it's essentially impossible to talk about revolutionary politics without an active and conscious rejection of the status quo. Maybe it doesn't have to be it's so conscious. I mean, this is, one of the points that the late Joshua Clover, who we just lost, has been good at making, is that sometimes the rejection isn't sort of a conscious reflection on how bad the status quo is. Sometimes the rejection of the status quo is a visceral revolt. I mean, how else can you understand something as powerful as, the Baltimore riot or the Ferguson revolt or the George Floyd rebellion, if it's it's an active rejection, even without the sort of component of philosophical inquiry and so forth. It doesn't have to be sort of self-consciously communist. It's a rejection of the status quo. So I think these things, they happen, and they don't need a philosopher like me to recommend them. And the reason they happen, whether or not a philosopher like me lives or dies or says anything at all about it, is because the status quo is insufferable and unsustainable, and it's killing us, and in various ways, and killing different people in different ways. And so, I mean, what happens when people rise up is they are reacting against an insufferable conditions of life, and that has to be specified. It's different in Gaza than it is in Minnesota. There's a sense that something has to change, something has to be abolished. It doesn't necessarily come through Marxist philosophy or any sort of academic inquiry, but there's an imagination at work. And I think many people have tried to bring this out, and some people have tried to bring it out, I think, better than others. So in my book, for example, two of the sources that I use to show that is W.E.B. Du Bois and the importance of the imagination at work in the transatlantic slave trade, about getting free, about human freedom. And of course, there are struggles, there are slave revolts, there are all kinds of things going on, but there's also an imagination at work. And the other person who I use, there are others as well beyond these two, but one of them that I think is really important, another great kindred spirit, I would say, is Drusilla Cornell. And she was a great philosopher of the imagination. And she talked about the importance of the imagination that grows out of exploitation, and different forms of human suffering give rise to imaginary horizons, right? So one thing that's very materialistic about my approach here on the imagination is that it's not disconnected from the material conditions of life at all. So I'm not talking about somebody who is imagining the next world of, in the Star Wars franchise. And some of them are pretty awesome, I have to say, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the imagination that comes out of conditions of life. And so, there was one example of this that really sort of I found very moving was maybe 5 or 6 months ago, there was a critical care doctor in Gaza she was going around trying to figure out what she could do there. And when she reported back, what she said was that everywhere she went, she found the same thing, that children were no longer able to dream, that they weren't able. And it was striking because she wasn't looking at Gaza from the point of view of a psychological crisis, which obviously that is also, and every crisis also has its psychological dimensions, right? So, but that wasn't her purpose. She was a critical care intervention relief worker, but the main confrontation was about the inability to dream of a tomorrow. And I found that very striking. And it is something that I wouldn't have had the courage to even suggest in a place like Gaza, that dreams actually mattered. But that's what people on the ground were telling her. Could you imagine looking at Gaza in the way that many of us do on screens, looking at the rubble and the children who are buried, and thinking about dreams? It seems inappropriate. It seems wrong. And yet that's what she had reported was something that reliably came up time and again. So I think it's crucial that the imagination comes alive at some point. You have to think about something other than Gaza, such as it is. This is crucial from their point of view. I mean, I don't have it as a sort of social science, data set, but this is just a striking report from the genocide. But, the other thing is, and this goes back to Mark Fisher, whose work I really appreciate and really respect deeply. But at the same time, I never really liked this idea of post-capitalism, right? Because I can imagine many post-capitalist realities that might be worse. You could say, okay, we're not like, I mean, Mackenzie Wark has said that this isn't capitalism; it's something worse, right? Now that's a whole nother conversation. There's a lot that could be said about that, but the point that I take from it is that post-capitalism isn't imaginative enough, right? And so, not to take anything away from Fisher's crucial interventions, extremely important in my view, but post-capitalism lacks imaginary power. Why? Because post specifies a temporality. I mean, that's essentially what it's doing. It's telling us that there's something after capitalism. I think there's hope in that idea, that there could be something after capitalism. It implies the end of capitalism. That's great. But there are things that I could imagine as post-capitalist realities, right, which are not even close to something we want. I mean, it's possible for someone to say that Gaza is a post-capitalist reality right now. And I don't think that's the right analysis. But why should we assume that post-capitalism is something we want? There has to be some imagination about other forms of life and social relations. So to that point, right, Adam, about the social relations, I think that there are examples of human relationality that aren't ruled by capitalist exchange relations. And so part of what I'm doing in a book like The Communism of Love is I'm saying things that are often called utopian are things we practice all the time. And I mean, to Will's point, this is sort of an anarchist approach, right? I mean, why hide it? Why conceal it? I mean, can we be done with that? It's not like it's 1871 and everything depends on whether you're going with Proudhon or Marx. It's absurd. We're living in a different historical moment. And, and some of the imagination about different forms of life comes out of experiences of suffering, of racial profiling and genocide, all different forms of abuse, mass incarceration. Some of the most imaginative students I've ever had were in the prison system. When I teach in the prison, I encounter people who aren't, worried about the impracticality of Marx. I mean, the imagination is oxygen. Imagination is oxygen. There's a place for people whose imagination gives out in the carceral system. It's not a good place to be. It's a box. And there's no care. There's nothing coming to help you there. And so I think, in our already existing social relations among friends and comrades and between those that we love, we can find already practiced social relations, which in various ways do not abide by the logic of capitalist social relations or exchange relations. So there are many ways to get at it. But if you notice, in all of the ways that I'm thinking, the imagination is grounded in, in material experiences, some of them very good, some of them very beautiful. The love and solidarity of people who come together includes this imaginary content I'm after, right? But also in the face of brutal police brutality, the George Floyd rebellion, there's imagination at work there too. And all of it has to do with the capacity for us to think through the status quo to some other possibility. And, at the end of the day, if we give up on that, then we have to some extent at least, abandon revolution. But there's nothing we need more. There's really nothing we need more. What we're seeing here too, and this the sort of the point on this revolutionary question and the imagination is, over where you are, Adam, there's going to be a historical materialism conference coming up in the fall of 2025. And the theme of it is, something to do with the end of the liberal order, right? I mean, I think that's really quite right. And you mentioned this too. I mean, people are seeing that liberal capitalism is not going to protect them from fascism. Liberal capitalism is not going to protect us from, looming and already present ecological catastrophe. Liberal capitalism is not going to protect us from the one that's sneaking up, that a lot of Marxists are insufficiently attentive to, which is the psychosocial crisis of young people all around the world. And it's just not doing anything it doesn't have anything to offer. It has nothing to offer. The HM conference frames it right. I mean, we are at the end of the promise of liberal capitalism. I think more and more people, as you said, can see that. And so we've got to be willing to step into the fray and think about alternatives, and rival visions are a crucial part of that. We have to. Otherwise, we're essentially just taking the position that, right, the liberal order is totally impoverished. Liberal capitalism can help us, can give us what we need, but there's nothing else that can either. And this is really, it seems to me, the worst possible thing to do here at the end of the world, as it were. So, I mean, you could, the other thing too with the imagination is that it doesn't solve the problems. And I think this has to be said. Before we come to any kind of end of our conversation, I just have to be very clear about that point, that it isn't that when I say imaginary power, real horizons, it isn't that if we can exercise our imaginary powers, we'll just get there. And there's nothing like that. I mean, I've read too much continental postmodern philosophy, what we've done. There's this kind of confidence that, if we can just imagine it, we can make it. I mean, this is essentially just the mirror image of the capitalist lie. It's bullshit, and we can't accept that. But but to say that imagination doesn't get us where we need to go is quite different than from saying that we need, nonetheless, a radical imagination at work. We need to bring it out. We need to enter the fray with rival visions. We need to step into this end times of liberal capitalism and talk about other possibilities now more than ever. And there's an appetite for it. I completely agree with this point, what you made in the beginning of your comment. I think people are looking for it. And what else can we do? I mean, is there anything else? Are there other possibilities? And if not communists, who else will say yes?
I think I just want to follow up on, again, then, on the question of practicality. And I know that we've been circling this quite a bit here. But one of the things about the treating communism as an alternative proposition about the world, as a program which can replace not just because the way in which we live our lives and the mechanisms of control have become so indistinguishable that it's almost impossible to really try to propose a communism that captures logistical capitalism, right, and can replace it. And part of the problem with programmatic communism as a kind of not just a betrayal of the movement of communism, but also as just frankly an attempt to treat it as one political framework against another, to just be brutally Hobbesian about it, is that it always tries to remain sort of within the realm of interpretability through the framework of capitalist understandings of expenditure and cost and return. And this is part of the problem of treating sort of communism as a goal. It's not just that, that Soviet factories that are just squalid and have horrendous working conditions had above their gate, communism is our goal, right? It's also that the moment you step into the for lack of a better word, the ontological epistemic framework of capital, once that is the worldview, it's very hard to step outside of it. So what are some ways in which using this new conception of power through the imaginary allows for us to frankly do something that it comes across as quote unquote theoretical or poetic, which is to think differently. Because that comment about the inability to dream amidst the horrors of an ongoing genocide reminds me of Primo Levi's assertion of shame, right? It's not just a shame to say, is this a man, right? The shame is much deeper. It's like, oh my goodness, the entire worldview has made it possible to look at a person and even ask that question, right? There has to be a shame in saying we've foreclosed on the future for someone. And I'm wondering, what role does there need to play in reviving the imaginary as a zone of political contestation, not just as, an element in a given political program or a given actualization or some sort of precursor to its actualization?
Yeah, it's a very tough question, and I think it's crucial because you do an excellent job, I think, of bringing into sharp relief the scale of the challenge, right? This entrenchment of life inside of our existing capitalist societies makes everything appear, at least to some extent, opportunistic, fleeting, potentially nothing, because not every crisis is going to be understood even as a crisis of capital. Right? And that's sort of the deep point about entrenchment, right? Is that you can see, we can say that, okay, but this problem, this crisis in our lives is a crisis of capital brought about by the capitalist organization of life on Earth. But that's a really academic point. It's sort of making an analysis of a crisis that doesn't travel very far. And, whenever there's a major crisis, going back to the somewhat recent Great Recession in 2008, 2009, you have people all around the world who are talking about an economic crisis, a global economic crisis, without mentioning the name of the system, right? That is to say, it's about several men, a few bad actors, a few bad apples, but this level of talking about it in terms of systems crisis and systems failure and points of entry for new possibilities, it actually is, and I think this is a fair point, it's trapped. It's hard to imagine making these things grow and go and sort of escape a kind of poetic reflection within our own milieus, if that makes any sense. So this is an extremely big challenge. I guess, it's a part of this for me when I was working on the communism of love is to say communism isn't a goal. It's not something that we are trying to arrive at. In many places, it's already here, in miniature, right? In miniature, we can find in our own lives that a lot of our relationships, the ones that matter the most to us, simply break with the logic of capital. It would make no sense. It would be impossible, for example, to call someone a friend who asked for $20 an hour in exchange for their friendship. It just would essentially offend everybody, including the worst capitalists on earth. So part of my hope, and it's really practically just a tiny contribution, if even that, is to say, do not give credit to capitalism for the best things in our lives, right? Is that the best things in our capitalist societies tend to be the least capitalist things. The best things in capitalism are the least capitalist things. And if it's possible to reflect on that, I think the practicality, in this sense, Will, when I say practicality, I mean that it's already being practiced, right? The practicality of communism, in that it's already being practiced, can be seen. So in some way, it's a modest contribution, is to say, I want you to see, maybe it's possible that, I don't know if I would be willing to say it still, I'm so young, but that in some ways, this is the cause of my life's work, is to want to help people to see the practicality of a different logic of life. And this, again, the practicality in the sense that it's happening. It's not a goal to be achieved in a programmatic way. I completely agree with that point. I think this idea of communism as some, loosely organized global achievement, right, that's somewhere on the horizon that we'll get at through some coordination of proletarian revolts, is, I think that one has to see a tombstone when they're standing in front of it. And so you either have to think anew about what are the material conditions for communism now, or you can hold to, an idea that is buried in the graveyard. And that's one of the lines I like from, Raoul Vannigan's The Revolution of Everyday Life, is, as Marxists, and he wasn't trying to help Marxists out by any stretch, but in the opening lines of that book, he talks about, if you're going to just talk about class struggle and go on talking about class struggle in the same ways people were doing it 150 years ago, his line is, you've got a corpse in your mouth. And I think as communists, we don't want to speak a dead language. So what we can do is fairly well trapped. I'd like to see it travel. I'd like to help on some way. In terms of the imagination, I do think the imagination is under assault. It's quite interesting how openly that is now happening, that, universities like the ones that I think the three of us are at are under attack, because there is a very open, on the surface, recognition that some ideas are dangerous, that for certain ways of thinking should not be rewarded, and that universities that welcome certain ways of thinking should be punished. What is this if not a confession? What is it if not a confession when the ruling classes are so concerned about what we are thinking about and talking about? And no one can now say that, they don't care. They absolutely do care. They always have. But now it is more brazen and open. It is more publicly confessed, daily demonstrated, right? The shuttering of universities, the attack on the humanities, liberals rolling out the red carpet for AI and ChatGPT, basically saying, liberal professors basically saying, how can we roll out the red carpet for the obsolescence of what we do? People don't need to imagine anymore. They don't need to wrestle with ideas, to think about possibility. We can just have a machine do it for us. So the liberals inside and the reactionaries on the outside of these already problematic capitalist institutions, we have to say that, of course, are nonetheless telling us very clearly, loudly, over and again, that they think that our thinking is dangerous. And why else would the ruling class not just leave us alone to teach Marx and critical race theory? Why else would the ruling class not just leave us alone to talk about capitalism? Why are they so concerned with it? It's a confession. And maybe they're wrong, but there's a part of me that hopes that they are right. And there's a part of me that hopes the specter still haunts. And it does, I think. The specter still haunts. They still want to stop us from doing what we're doing. And so therefore we have to keep on doing what they want to stop us from doing. It doesn't mean that the discourse of, imaginary power and Marxism and communism will necessarily travel beyond the boundaries of our poetic milieus and political milieus. This is something I have no idea of how to solve this problem, but I think that we shouldn't forget their confession
Well, one of the ways I think that your book, especially sort of around chapter 9 on the practicality of utopianism, is very helpful, actually, particularly in tackling for what. So, just to go back to one of the things you said just briefly, you mentioned that the love relation shows that there are so many things that would be offensive even to the worst capitalists. And but you mentioned ChatGPT, and the predominant use of that is for therapeutic. That is a $20 friendship subscription, and that's in ways showing how bad things have gotten. And one of the things I really want to pick up on is, in terms of you talking about the practicability of communism, the fact that we do it, and I think there is to some extent something in which, as individuals who try to do these things, they're not particularly always rewarding because we end up doing them on our own. But nonetheless, we still do them. I mean, for example, comrades, you're listening here. Why haven't you been to McDonald's in 2 years? It's honestly, why do you follow me? If you think, this stuff can't, if you don't believe this sort of thing can scale, you wouldn't be doing the stuff you're already doing. Especially when it comes to reading theory text, which, as I've always said, is part of the reason we do this stuff here, is because don't read them on your own. And if you're going to read them on your own, read them in such a way that you basically aren't doing it anyway, because you're carrying a whole sort of semiotic lineage of interpretation and experience of them around you. And one of the really interesting things you pick up in chapter 9 is the idea of loneliness and the idea of capital. Communism will not abolish loneliness, but it will abolish the present state of things. And in that order of things is the kind of loneliness that makes us, a thing to each other and to ourselves. I was wondering, could we unpack this idea of the capitalist mode of loneliness? I don't know. I mean, I occasionally like to say it's today, it's almost like misery is a mode of production, as it always has been. But it's only today it's more explicit because our mental output is so productive in terms of data gathering and the like. But yeah, how do we think the problematic then of loneliness in terms of the communist imagination?
Yeah, and I mean, it's really important for me, and I hope that others would agree. This is the case that has to be made, and I try to make in the book that we cannot be ungrounded utopians who would say, if we had a communist form of life, no one would be lonely. It's absurd, and could not, of course, be taken seriously. But that shouldn't stop us from considering different forms of loneliness. And so part of what I'm doing in that chapter is I'm building out a bit from an insight that I always found very striking at the end of Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism, where you come to, page 400 and whatever, and you're quite surprised, or at least I was quite surprised, to find that she comes to the topic of loneliness. And she is very careful to distinguish loneliness from solitude. As Arendt is keen to do, is always to distinguish each word and its definition. But, it's quite different solitude, where one chooses a book and prefers not to go to the party, and doesn't very good at rocking back and forth on their heels and socializing for whatever reason. Loneliness is a condition which is often imposed upon you. It's quite different from loneliness and certain forms of politics. And here's where Arendt really is quite limited. Capitalism preys upon human loneliness. I mean, she's thinking about fascism, totalitarianism. She's thinking about the ways in which the totalitarianism of the 20th century was predatory on human loneliness, and that you could say to people, well, we have a sort of an ethno-nationalist movement. We're all a part of this bundle of twigs, this fasces, and we come together with this kind of solidarity, and you're not alone. You're not lonely anymore. And I think populism provides, and if you look at right-wing populism right now in the United States, I mean, part of its strength is the way that it brings people together into this kind of a visceral and intensely emotional sense of togetherness against the intellectual elites, togetherness against the snooty, looking down on their noses of the bourgeois liberals who think they know everything and now we're in charge. But those rallies are social events. Right-wing populism isn't some kind of an antidote to loneliness. But I think Arendt was right about the appeal of rather dangerous things like fascism and ethno-nationalism. Now, where she tends to say less is on the question of capitalism. And just take a look at what capitalism does with loneliness. I mean, it's predatory too. And so this is where we have to move beyond Arendt, perhaps back to Marx. And we have to think about, the sort of the market of loneliness, the kind of the seizure of the marketplace of loneliness. And there, of course, you get to things like social media, and there's all the kind of curmudgeonly, Frankfurt critical theory approaches you can take about this is not real sociality, or something maybe, that Habermas would have said in the 1970s, that Jürgen Habermas might have said in the 70s, like it's not a real, it has to be sort of, okay, fine. But I mean, a lot of that is actually true. They're quite, perhaps it's become fashionable in some circles to say that the critical theorists were just wrong about everything, but that's absurd. They had deep insights into the capitalist predation of human loneliness. Now they have to be evolved. We have to evolve those understandings. I mean, I would say perhaps more than Adorno and Horkheimer and all of that, and Habermas. I think Erich Fromm was very good on sort of the capitalist predation of human loneliness. So part of it is for us to be critical of loneliness as communists is we have to look at the commodification of feeling. We have to look at the commodification of attention sold as units. Right? How much human attention can you capture? It's a field of contestation to capture attention, time, emotionality. A lot of people are studying, a lot of Marxists are looking at Jonathan Crary and 24/7 and Franco Berardi. I mean, there are a lot of people who are looking at, loneliness, right? I mean, Berardi just wrote this book, Quit Everything, and I think is, whatever maybe the limitations of some of that, everything has limitations. There isn't anything that doesn't have them, but it's really important. I think it's the right approach. What we want to do is we want to say what's being done with our attention, right? What's being done with our affective states is damaging. Right? This relates back to what I was saying before about the psychosocial crisis. When Berardi talks about Alan Ehrenberg, the author of the fatigue de soi, the exhaustion of the self, there are people who are looking at this in a very systematic way. And I think that what we have to do is we have to say, okay, we're not talking about, abolishing loneliness, but communism is talking about forms of life in which we would relate to one another, and feelings of loneliness and depression and anxiety and affectation of different type in a different way. And so then for me, this all goes back to Marx and the concept of the Gemeinwesen, right? Because if you're in the Grundrisse, when Marx talks about the Gemeinwesen, he's talking about the common sensibility of the community or the community, but he always talks about Gemeinwesen in two ways in Grundrisse. The first is the Gemeinwesen we have, and then the other is the possible Gemeinwesen, right? The Gemeinwesen of possibility. And so, it from a communist point of view seems to me that, what would be the orientation we would want? Would we want this kind of individualistic predation of people's feelings of inadequacy and loneliness and social isolation, insecurity about themselves and about their futures? Or would we want something else, which is some kind of a social solidarity, some kind of a real movement, to use, again, the positive side of Marx's definition of communism? And yes, insofar as the right wing of today is offering that in right-wing populism, I'm all for a left-wing alternative to that. In fact, I have to say that I don't think that we can beat right-wing populism with some bourgeois liberals who speak to 7 people in cars. It's got to be something that, brings people together with a similar kind of, how should you put it, a similar type of social energy or something like that. It isn't necessarily communist, but as I say, communism is in there. It's in there, and part of my goal would be to sort of maybe, hopefully, bring that to light, so that you could see it as opposed to not seeing it, or so that you could see it and call it something that is an alternative. You would see, for example, when people gather and talk about oligarchy, and when people gather and there's 12,000 people who are upset about oligarchy, they're not talking about Trump, they're talking about oligarchy, that there may be something communist in there, and we shouldn't give credit to capitalism for its existence. This is, but so, yeah, I think this is really very important, because if we do not attend to our loneliness in I would say communist ways, as it were, that loneliness will be attended to by our enemies, as they have become quite expert at doing. And I don't even know that we could beat them. They're so good at it. And this goes back to Will's point. It's this whole thing about practicality that Will was saying, we're circling around it. There is no easy answer here, other than to say that, it's important, I think, to talk about it with one another and to resist it and to imagine that there may be other things that could be done together to address feelings of isolation, anxiety about our futures, depression, loneliness, and so forth.
I think that's like a wonderful place, actually, to sort of cap off our discussion. Again, we've been talking about the text Imaginary Power, Real Horizons, and it's just been so great to have you on. So many of our listeners have worked through your texts and contributions, and thank you so much. I know Craig probably has some announcements to throw at the end of this thing, but I'll leave that to him. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.